Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. I'm here with my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
Yeah, welcome. Well, today we have a very special guest. Derek Robertson is a writer, reporter, and producer at Politico, helming the Digital Future Daily newsletter and contributing bi-monthly to Politico magazine. Derek covers emerging technologies with a particular focus on extended reality and the metaverse. He's been published in The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Ringer, The Washington Examiner, Bandbite, Indianapolis Monthly, and others. Derek is a graduate of Wayne State University in Detroit and the Meadows School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Derek, welcome to Community Technology.
Thank you, Stu.
Okay. I think we're going to start off a little bit with some news. Dave, what's going on in the tech world?
Well, I promised to introduce our guest to a story that he probably hasn't noticed, because almost nobody has. New York City is on the cusp of getting the best wireless network in the world. It's already started building. What? Most people would say to that. And
yeah,
we've talked about it.
Starting in Manhattan as usual, right, Dave?
Well, actually not.
No?
New York put its foot down and said if they're going to build the network, they're going to have to start building it out in the boroughs. And in fact, the first two kiosks or mini towers or 32-foot poles, whatever you want to call them, are in the Bronx and in Queens. These are really impressive. And the news hook on this is the company that was going to put them up, Zenfi Networks, just got bought out by the BAI, nothing to do with the radio station. The folks who put the Wi-Fi in New York City subways, among other things. Quiet outfit so far, but extraordinarily well financed and controlled by Canadian pension funds, which are very, very big and definitely into infrastructure spending. This is an old dream. It goes back 20 years or more to Paul Baran, who put up a Ricochet, trying to get little wireless units, again, literally almost every block. We've had this NYC Link kiosk thing, which has worked some. It was supposed to have 5,000 out there now. It didn't happen. There are about 2,000. And nearly all of them are in Manhattan. The city, in return for not collecting tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions that would do from the old contract, agreed to waive most of that if the new people who had taken over the NYC Link built out the boroughs. Mm-hmm. That's about to happen. And what's going on in the boroughs is essentially mini towers high enough for practical purposes to bring 5G and Wi-Fi to almost everybody, including most apartments, with units inside for 4 different carriers to put in their 5G equipment. Neutral access. And if BAI has put in what's going to be hundreds of millions, Zenfi had raised 200 million already. So that's enough money to get this started. This is going to be an extraordinary build, even ahead of the Chinese. Did you know this story, Derek?
No, I wasn't aware of this. Will this be for public Wi-Fi, sort of akin to what you can access on the subway?
This is the public Wi-Fi that you saw in all those little kiosks, or at least it's the successor to that outfit. and it's going to have the public Wi-Fi included, plus one heck of a 5G network. I've met with them. They started building just a handful, and they really do intend to hook up the whole city this way. And I know the technology is there, and they had 200 million even before the BAI investment. So this is important.
Couldn't that be sort of massively disruptive to companies? You know, I pay for internet every month with Optimum. It seems like that has the potential to be very economically disruptive.
Destructive or constructive?
Disruptive.
I'm more interested
disruptive.
in getting people. I'm more interested in getting people connected than increasing Tom Rutledge's pension, which has.
Well, Dave, this is good news if it pans out. You know, I can remember. I go back far enough, Derek. I remember when the link system first started, and New York City at the time revoked all of the paid telephone franchises, all the paid telephone operators in New York City. And I was at a number of the public hearings where that happened. And the payphone operators, they were the small independents, they were outraged. They got paid a little bit of money to walk away and were not at all happy. And New York City sold the dream that at the time that they were going to create these kiosks that provided free Wi-Fi on the corners of the city, as well as information kiosks, the news information, et cetera, et cetera. As Dave mentioned, it really did not pan out. And this is probably going back almost 10 years, Dave. You probably have the date, but I can remember being at the public hearings and talking to the payphone guys, and a lot of them are really just kind of outraged. They did not want to pay out. They wanted to continue their business. But anyway, the march of technology moved forward. And I'm glad to hear now, Dave, that maybe finally new operator, new financing, new technology, maybe the kiosks are going to actually bring some connectivity to the city. And if they disrupt the existing guys, I think that's a good thing, Derek, and just from where I sit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's interesting that it's starting in the outer boroughs. You have Eric Adams delivering on his promise to be an outer boroughs mayor in this way, although I'm sure it's been in the works for a long time.
They've actually been very strong supporting this. They jumped in hard. I know the people who are doing it, they have the technical ability. Zenfi has one of the most intense dark fiber networks in the world. They're hooking up most of the cell sites in New York with their own fiber, which is underneath most of the streets of Manhattan already. And they're real, the ability to build. I know the technology works because this is essentially high-end, this is advanced Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi 6 now is getting to be just fine. And Wi-Fi 7 with the expanded spectrum is going to have even more capacity. I don't think they could replace all the fiber going to people's homes and the cable going to people's homes, but that's an open question. The technology makes that possible, and it looks like there's enough financing. Let's go on to the next story. Facebook has just raised the price of virtual reality by 33%. The Quest headset, which is actually remarkable for its price and almost works reasonably well, is going up from $300 to $400. Now, that's something you've been working on. What's your impression, Derek?
Well, it's unusual, to be sure. You don't normally see the price of a consumer technology just sort of, if you compare it to something like it's a platform like a PlayStation or an Xbox, and you don't normally see the prices of those things going up over time. So it's kind of an interesting indicator of where, Meta is, of course, expected to announce its first earnings reduction relatively soon. I think that they are feeling the heat and tightening their belt a little bit. They probably also realize at this point that most of the people who are purchasing these headsets are kind of enthusiastic early adopters who are invested enough in the tech that they are okay with spending $100 more. The people who wanted to buy it as sort of a novelty Christmas gift for their kids have probably all already done that. They're also planning on floating a big new line of headsets at some point within the next year. I think they're expected to introduce 4 new types of headsets. So there might be a little bit of kind of squeezing the last amount of juice out of the lemon, as it were, before the tech goes to the next generation. It's an interesting sign. I have a Quest myself, and it's a flawed piece of hardware, but it's probably the best version of VR that I've used. So I can see, why they probably felt comfortable keep raising the price and keeping it targeted toward early adopters, even though it is quite an unusual choice that I think reveals the financial bind that Meta is in.
Has it been an upgrade in the tech in the device, or is it same device, increased price?
It's the same device that they're raising the price on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Now,
It's unusual.
we invited Derek onto the show because he had a remarkable title of a story he had about virtual reality. Tell us what you're hearing or what you saw.
Yeah, so I wrote an item, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, about Chinese companies' approach to VR and the metaverse, and I titled it "The Metaverse with Chinese Characteristics," which was sort of a nod to Chinese political history. Back in the Deng Xiaoping era, he would refer to China's economic model as socialism with Chinese characteristics. And that's evolved over time to kind of be used in different ways to refer to China's unique blend of not notionally Maoist communism and socialism with the kind of hybrid market economy that actually exists in China. So I just thought I would do a little nod for the political Chinese history buffs who might subscribe to the newsletter.
TikTok is showing that the Chinese can compete quite well in even with Facebook. Should Facebook be worried that its metaverse is going to be taken over by the Chinese?
No, because China's version of the metaverse is likely to look much like the rest of their internet. There's a term that people in the tech world use to describe the web in China, called the quote splinternet. That is an internet that is largely walled off from the rest of the world. You cannot use Facebook in China. I think that
is that good or bad from the Chinese point of view?
Well, that's a question that invites a bunch of different interpretations.
Okay, let's say about it from the Indians' point of view. Is having Facebook in dominating the Indian online world good or bad for India?
That is, when it comes to India, I'm not quite as familiar with their technology landscape as I should be. But, a company like Facebook, they have had many recorded deleterious effects when just kind of dropped into society, as we saw in Myanmar. The reason that I was stymied by your question about China is that China has its own kind of issues with, repressive technology and technology of disrupting effects, but those are not driven by a private company like Facebook from another country. Those are internal sort of national political issues. I think that there's a reason that China keeps Facebook out of their country, because of it can have that kind of technology can have very unexpected and disruptive impacts, like you've seen in India, Myanmar, other similar countries. So I think that to bring this back around to the metaverse, that's exactly what China is hoping to prevent. The vision of the metaverse that most of its builders present is one where every space, whether it's a space that's created by Meta, whether it's a space that's created by Microsoft, by Sony, by smaller companies, is linked and open, and that you can carry your identity and your goods through those spaces. And that's kind of anathema to the way China views the internet. They advocate, they have the same amount of state control over their internet that they have over everything else. So I think that you aren't likely to see China's metaverse technology take over Facebook so much as remove a big chunk of Facebook's, potential global market, as has happened with their core product.
Well, you just said something that really surprised me, because everything I know about Facebook says they want to dominate the metaverse, not really make it open. In particular, they want to cut as much as 30% off every financial transaction there, just as they do on Apple and Google on every app, which is being resisted around much of the world, which is one of the reasons I talk about what effect we're having on India and Korea and Britain and so on. Why do you say you think Facebook will really be open? Is that really their business plan?
I'm happy that you asked me that, because I coincidentally wrote about this very topic for today's newsletter. There is the concept that most of the companies that are building the metaverse believe it is based on is called interoperability. The idea that I described before, that you can connect various different virtual worlds. Now, most of the people who work I have not interviewed anyone at Facebook about this yet, or Meta, but most of the people I have spoken to in the VC community, people who are involved in building metaverse technology, say that the idea of interconnectivity and profitability is aligned. That is to say, in the same way the global economy benefits from the standardization of the size of shipping containers and such things, the metaverse would benefit from having kind of tools that connect various spaces. Now, of course, that's the industry's viewpoint on it. I've also spoken to many regulators who say that in such an environment, obviously you're going to have companies with established, entrenched market shares like Meta dominate that space and shape it in ways that will be beneficial to them. And I think as the metaverse is built, you will have regulators push back and try to incorporate. We've already seen, just minutes before this recording started, the FTC announced that it was suing Meta for its acquisition of a VR company under sort of an antitrust ethos. So there's an argument to be made by Meta and other companies that openness and interconnectivity can lead to a bigger pie for people to split up, but we don't really know yet whether that will be the case. And there are plenty of counterexamples as to, take for example, what happened with the original internet, which was designed under an open protocol by government and public-private partnerships, and which came to be dominated by a few large companies. So there is a stated argument, but it's not quite clear yet whether that's actually how it will shake out.
Yeah, I winced when you said that it was going to be an interoperable, because we're talking to different people. You're sitting in a political realm where people have reasons to say they're going to be interoperable. I spend my time in the industry where everybody talks about building platforms with moats around them so that they control them. And I'm looking at the rebellion around the world against domination by a few big companies, all in the US or China. Have you watched the European response and the fines against Facebook and Amazon and Google that is happening there?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Europe has been so much more aggressive in regulating tech than America has. And, it's on one hand, it's very, I think most people in America are somewhat, to put it mildly, a little bit unhappy with the way their internet works for them. And there are a lot of things that we think would just be common sense regulations that it seems almost impossible to do. So in one sense, it's kind of impressive and surreal in some ways to look across the Atlantic Ocean and see Europe just confidently doing those things. Of course, you can also make a sort of skeptical economic argument as to why they do it, which is that regulation allows European tech companies to be more competitive with American tech companies that dominate the globe. But there aren't too many things in this world that have purely altruistic or purely sort of craven and greedy reasons. So I think both motivations can be true at the same time.
Yeah, Mike Powell put it this way years back. He said, I don't know what the public interest really is, or if there isn't really any definition of a public interest. He was FCC chair at the time, conservative Republican who now is a lobbyist for Comcast. And that's the world you're in when you're talking about Washington. But let's take it back. Privacy. We've also been looking at that. We've got somebody coming for the next show who's very strong on the limits of the current American privacy proposal. Do you think we're going to actually have a meaningful privacy proposal, or is it going to be extremely limited?
Yeah, I think you point at something very salient here, which is that it depends on your definition of meaningful. I think that privacy is an issue in my working for Politico and keeping an eye on regulators. Privacy seems to be one of the few things that almost everyone can agree on. I mean, rhetorically, to finish my point, it seems like something you can agree on rhetorically. Nobody likes the notion of having their privacy invaded, but the tech industry obviously has been very persuasive in persuading legislators and regulators that they should be able to harvest ad data, with impunity. I think there are certain political issues around which privacy is going to become really salient. For example, with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, a lot of Democratic politicians are extremely concerned about privacy when it comes to reproductive rights. There have been not dozens, but many European countries that have taken really severe action on facial recognition privacy, specifically with the company Clearview AI. The ACLU just settled a big lawsuit with them that prevented them from collecting or from sharing facial recognition data with private companies. So I think that there is a sort of inchoate desire to do something on privacy, but I don't think there is any clear sign as to what it will actually be. And that always, when there's a lack of agreement on details, that is where legislation goes to die. So I have some skepticism to your original point.
Yeah. I consider the current privacy bill that is probably going to pass in DC an attempt to reduce privacy compared to what the state of California and others are already doing. And that's why it's got support from, among other things, a number of tech companies. But why don't we bring Stu back into this? He's going to have to lead us into a break in a minute. Stu, do you really think that the existing US Senate and Congress is going to protect our privacy as well as the Chinese do?
I don't have a lot of insight into the actual bill. Well, what I have been looking at is just the behavior of Congress, and I'm very unimpressed with them. In my mind, my observation, I should say, they have been very much doing the bidding of corporate America and not the people. So I don't have a lot of faith. Again, not knowing the specifics of what legislation is on the table, but my sense is at the end of the movie, they're going to cave into the interests of the tech folks and the folks that benefit from the buying and the selling of all this information. I mean, it's billions and billions of dollars. It's a global market. And I really just don't see it being shut down by legislation. I wish that were not the case, but I don't believe it's going to happen. And that's just
And
based
what
on
does Politico
the
think
behavior of the
about
politicians. They've not, like I said, I have not examined the legislation, but I'm looking at the politicians and how they're behaving, and I'm not impressed.
We've got a guest who actually is reporting this every day. Is Stu on target? Are the politicians in America really going to give us a strong privacy bill? Is that realistic?
I think it's possible. Something a political, one of the things that plays into this dynamic is that you have a very unlikely alliance between there are left-wing politicians who have sort of explicitly stated concerns about antitrust and privacy, and you have many right-wing politicians who want to weaken the tech industry because they feel like they are politically disadvantaged by them, censored on Facebook. They have sort of a mandate from their voters to go after big tech. It's an effective thing to demagogue on, you are the right-wing politician who's pushing back against Facebook and their desire to censor you or whatever a user may believe, regardless of the extent of however that's true. So you have the possibility for a very sort of unlikely horseshoe coalition, as it were, that would have some will to enact privacy legislation. But like I was saying before, I'm not exactly sure what form that will take yet, if it does, if legislation does actually pass through both houses. At which point, Stu, you have to introduce a break, I think, for us now.
Yes, it's about time. You're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Parliament. Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reid. Special guest, Derek Robertson from Politico. We'll be right back after a brief musical break. Stay tuned.
Your plans to make me blue with some other
Okay, we're back. This is Community Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reid. Special guest, Derek Robertson from Politico. Dave, I think you had a couple questions you wanted to throw at Derek?
Well, I just found out during the break that Derek is going to have to leave us in a little bit. I think we will finish the show. We only have 25 minutes to talk to somebody very interesting, Neal Stephenson. What's Neal doing these days, Derek?
So Neal Stephenson is, if listeners don't know, the science fiction author who famously coined the specific term metaverse in his novel Snow Crash, which was published in 1992. It's an extremely dystopian novel in which the metaverse is presented as a sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Essentially a pacifier for a civilization that has succumbed to rot and corruption and decay, etc. Today, right. Today, Neal has recently launched a program or a project that's called Lamina One, which is it is pitched as a developmental blockchain on which the real metaverse will be predicated. The idea being that this will basically be a development layer for people who want to build metaverse spaces and goods and protocols on the blockchain. And there's a big, this is sort of a point of contention within the world of metaverse development, whether it should or should not be based on blockchain technology. I think that Neal, I get the sense, I haven't spoken to him yet, I'm going to speak to him shortly, but I get the sense that he shares the sort of utopian view of many people in the crypto and Web3 community that blockchain technology can be used to foster a more open internet than the one more open and transparent internet than the one that currently exists. Of course, it has many, many other uses beyond that, and has been used in many other ways beyond that, including as just a rank vehicle for financialization. But there are many idealists in that space as well, and I think Neal is one of them, and that's what I'm going to interview him about.
Well, let's take back to what we were just talking about before. My gut is that Facebook wants to dominate the metaverse. And my evidence on that includes the 20% plus cut they intend to take, which would not work if the metaverse were truly open. My opinion. You may very well disagree with that one. Where does Neal stand, and does he have any chance?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the blockchain-based metaverse approach is, I think, although I think that the Meta has positioned themselves, they have messaged themselves to, as I was talking about before, sort of, they say, we're happy to coexist with these blockchain-based metaverses. Let's all hold hands and work together. Whether or not that will be how it plays out in practice remains to be seen. I think that blockchain-based metaverse projects are in direct competition with those that are built by private companies. Meta did its own experiment with a cryptocurrency that was based on the blockchain. It was a huge failure. Their Libra project, I don't see them dipping their toe back into that space anytime soon. So I think that's if you spend any meaningful amount of time around the Web3 evangelists and blockchain people, the ones who aren't just to get rich, and there are many of those, you will find that they have a true kind of crusading political aspect to their technology project. And I think I get the sense that Neal believes in that. So I think that anybody who is doing a project like that is inherently in contrast, at the very least, to companies like Meta and a metaverse world that looks more like the privatized metaverse that we have today, or privatized internet, excuse me.
Which is quite a strong thing for you to say, that our internet is controlled by private interests. So why don't you tell us a little bit more why you see it that way?
Sure. I mean, this is a debate that I also, as Stu introduced me at the top of the show, I write for Politico magazine as well, and kind of have written about debates over free speech and the web. And it is literally true that anybody can go online and make a website and say whatever they want, sell whatever they want, do whatever they want, as long as they don't get pulled offline by, their servers. As has happened to some political extremist websites that were trafficking.
Wait a minute. Did you
Sorry.
just call the former president of the United States a political extremist?
Well, this is you're getting to a key point I was about to make, which is that Donald Trump was free when he was kicked off Twitter to go attempt to start his own social media service. His social media service has not been successful because Twitter is such an entrenched interest that it effectively serves as the public town square. And I think that is where private companies in the model of the internet we have today that is sort of streamlined through a few central apps, that is where private companies flex their muscle over public life. They set the rules. Twitter's shareholders, or the people in Twitter's moderation department are not accountable to voters, nor are the people at Facebook's moderation department. And I think that is where you see the most credible arguments that so much of public life and media in the public sphere is basically owned by private interests. And that leads to a bunch of unpredictable results, like Donald Trump getting kicked off Twitter, and like right-wing politicians, making an unlikely alliance with left-wing politicians to combat those companies. It's a very we haven't really there have been very few points in American history where you've seen this kind of concentrated private ownership over something that's a public good. And they usually, I think back to the progressive era where you have the great anti-monopoly fervor of the Teddy Roosevelt administration. You have the kind of laws that were implemented in the aftermath of television, things like the Fairness Doctrine that were eventually broken down during the Reagan era. I think it's cyclical. I think there's a big appetite out there for people to weaken the hold that these companies have over public discourse, and I don't know what shape that will take, but I think that sentiment is pretty widespread.
What about outside the United States? What do they think about the same few companies?
Well, as we talked about earlier, Europe has been far more muscular in regulating them, and they, there's a massive asymmetry to the way these companies operate in the United States and globally, because the United States nominally has some ability to regulate them and to say what you can and can't do, or to trust bust, do things like that. A company like Facebook is incredibly powerful and very and then the European Union is somewhat limited in what they can say Facebook can and can't do. They can say what they can do to operate in their country, and they're having fierce negotiations over that right now. But there is a resentment in the rest of the world toward these companies because just as I described, Twitter's moderators being unaccountable to American voters, they're even less accountable to Lithuanian voters or Belarusian voters or Japanese voters. There's a massive kind of accountability asymmetry, and I think that makes people a little bit more resentful. Even while, if you people tend to vote with their time and their dollar, and it's not like there's a reason Meta is the biggest company in the world, is that despite all of this resentment, people still really like using their product. So it's never quite as simple as that. But I think there is a massive amount of mistrust.
I like to follow the money on this, as do many of the actual European politicians. And there's an enormous flow of money from the world to California and to Washington State, Facebook, Google, Amazon, and so on. And most of the world doesn't think this is a good thing. Nobody's been more aggressive about doing anything about that than Korea, which has effectively, has forced some of these companies, Apple in particular right now, to accept some competition that is not charging the 30% rake off the top that Apple was looking for. And they're doing it simply using traditional antitrust competition law. Facebook has agreed to go along with the requirement that, am I talking Facebook or YouTube? Or Apple? It's Apple. Has agreed to go along with Korean law, which says they have to allow other companies to handle the transactions who take a smaller rip-off than they do. Is this going to be viable, or is the US going to be using the political power to back up the market power of our companies around the world? Do the Koreans have a chance to reduce the Apple rake-off?
South Korea is a very interesting example because there's a long technology and manufacturing as their key industries. And I think that they are willing to be more aggressive than some other companies are because they have that tradition. I think that they're less likely to back down than some other countries would be in that situation. I'm not quite enough of a domain expert to confidently say, whether they can tell Apple who's the boss in that debate you're describing. But I think it is. It's an interesting case to watch when it comes to pushback against American tech companies' sort of influence globally. But I'm not entirely sure how, because of that unique history that they have, I'm not sure how applicable it is to other countries in the region or globally.
Well, obviously China has pushed back effectively. Japan has not. India is talking a very good game. And of course, they're succeeding domestically in some of the battles. Have you noticed Amazon, Walmart, and Geo fighting it out?
Are you referring to India?
India, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not
India
quite.
is much bigger than Korea, which is why it's the interesting case. And it's something like a democracy, just like we're something like a democracy.
Yeah, I'm not quite as familiar with that, but it sounds like especially when it comes to retail companies like that, I think that's potentially a very that might be a fruitful area for some lessons to be learned about how we deal with tech.
How we deal with them? Are we
Yes.
there talking about American government, American companies, or people and consumers around the world?
I mean, to the extent that there's that we can distinguish between the two, I'm not exactly sure. Like I was saying before, people tend to vote with their dollar and with their fee, and for as much it is always, I know I keep coming back to this point, so I apologize, but it is always striking to me sort of the disconnect between the amount of voiced sort of annoyance or discomfort with monopoly and overweening private power in American life, and the extent to which people really, really love the products that they offer. If you just look at how much time is spent on various apps and how much money flows toward them. So I think that now that politicians are willing to some politicians are willing to make a more explicit rhetorical case as for why there are problems with them and how they should be approached from a regulatory standpoint. Maybe that will change, but right now it's kind of it still almost seems like a subliminal issue running underneath American culture and politics.
Yeah, and I write about this stuff, the internet, which means that I try to keep out of well, I don't try to keep out of American politics. I'm actually in the middle of a lot of American politics, but I see it very differently than most of the people who have beltway blindness, who think that American politics should be the defining factor in this. The Europeans definitely disagree. I think there are over $10 billion worth of fines already against the major Americans. The Africans disagree. Most of Latin America disagrees. 2/3 of the world think that American companies in the United States shouldn't run the internet. Remember China, India at this point, have you caught the numbers on Indian internet users? How
No.
big they've gotten? Jio alone has 400 million. A very indigenous Indian company, even if they've taken a lot of money from Google and Facebook. They didn't need the money. It was a political play. Bharti is up there. At this point, you have more internet users in India than in the United States and Western Europe combined. So when I think about what's right for the internet, I think I see it rather differently than you do. Let's go to the idea of splinternet. Again, this is coming out of Korea, which is the most interesting one, and Taiwan. The United States is trying to split the internet very hard. Have you seen the stuff that's coming out of Tim Wu and the White House attempting to create, and also coming out of the foreign policy establishment, attempting to create an internet dominated by the US and allies?
What are you referring to specifically?
You see it in the article in foreign policy by the guy who Biden has nominated as his ambassador to the internet, which specifically says we have to take a leadership role, the US and our friendly allies, which they talk about as having similar ideals as we do and the Saudis and the Iraqis do. And there's a lot of rhetoric about democracy, but it's all coming from the security side. And that's happening now in Korea, where we are pushing hard on the Korean government to boycott the Chinese internet companies, in particular anybody in China who might make chips. Do you know what's happening? The Senate just passed the bill to give away a lot of money to chip makers, and they were going to have a lot of anti-Chinese clauses in it as of last week. Do you know whether those are still in?
I don't. I know I have been covering something else today, and the bill actually just passed the Senate today, so I am not 100% sure if that provision is still in it. But yes, I know what you're referring to.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's the biggest attempt to split the internet ever imagined. China is, depending on what you measure, 25 to 40% of the internet, and we're trying to hold them back and restrict their technology and their ability to make for example, any 5G phone without American permission.
Well, I believe that the idea is not that they are not allowed to manufacture 5G phones or 5G technology, but that the American security state is concerned about, their stated concern is that, including those technologies in American infrastructure would open them up to surveillance by the Chinese state. And
no, I'm not talking. We're not talking about the political issue in the United States about having some Chinese equipment. We're talking about the blockade of chip making capacity, which is fairly important to today's economy, which is effectively being done by the United States, who are holding back all the advanced chip making equipment, and now has asked ASML to cut back even the less advanced chip making equipment. And I don't know if you've seen it. We've got our foreign policy folks turning around and asking Korea to stop selling chip making equipment to China, as well as the TSMC manufacturing. That seems pretty serious. A split.
Yeah, what you're describing is sort of, a materials. This is a sort of geopolitical. It's geopolitical conflict. It's you think about countries had the way during the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union vied over who had access to what precious materials, uranium, et cetera, things like that. I think that is one area where this whole bill that just passed the Senate is explicitly aimed at competing with and sort of superseding China in technological advancement in that way. I think that's a separate issue from the splinternet, which is in my using that I used it earlier is used to refer to the literal sort of firewalling off of American websites from Chinese websites, et cetera. I don't necessarily see those things.
In other words, are you saying the splinternet is just another word for censorship? Because we certainly have a whole lot of censorship.
Sorry?
And Europeans have more.
Well, I think America, this ties in, this is what I was talking about earlier with regard to private companies. I think a lot of the reason that people are dissatisfied with private big tech companies in America is because there's no, well, you have a lack of accountability on both sides, right? And in America, privatized tech companies censor their platforms, and we can't vote on what they do or do not censor. In China, the state is heavily involved in censoring the internet, and people don't really have any meaningful say in what they censor, what they don't censor there either. So it's sort of pick your poison. Do you want to be censored by private tech companies or by, a state that's very comfortable exercising its state power over people's individual expression?
Well, it's also a matter of whether or not I've been involved in the ITU and internet governance and so on. Is whether or not, and I've even been on a State Department committee, whether or not China is allowed to manufacture the goods of the internet. That would seem, well, if you're saying that China can't make the chips necessary for today's internet, that seems to be pretty central to the discussion of whether we're splitting the internet or not. The Chinese certainly think so. The Indians think so. The Koreans think so.
It's not quite a speech issue, though, is it?
I'm saying speech is only a very small part of the question of are we splitting the internet? Because remember, we're trying to take over internet governance now, us and our allies, very strongly.
Is manufacturing competitiveness necessarily the same as internet governance? The TCP.
Why not?
Sorry, go ahead.
You're the one who put the word splinternet out there, and we're about to run out of time.
Okay.
So why don't I give you the last word, Stu? I've said plenty. Why don't we give our guest the last word?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'd like to hear from you, Derek. I know you're a bit of a futurist, and you talked about the big cycles earlier. I'm wondering, do you have any kind of insight or thoughts about where we're going to be 10, 20 years from now as you see the whole landscape evolving?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? I don't see a world where people spend any meaningfully smaller amount of time on the internet in the next 10 to 20 years. So therefore, I think that all of these questions that Dave and I were just talking about are going to become more salient. They're going to be more central to our politics. And I think that you will see a world where people are increasingly, they're financially, interpersonally linked to the devices that they own, and that therefore the salience of who controls those devices, who has access to the data on them, what protections are offered there when it comes to security, safety, privacy, et cetera. I think those will increasingly dominate our politics, and you will see politics organized along the lines, the way you had sort of the great, sort of 1980s Reagan era realignment around free enterprise versus, the old guard sort of liberal unionist infrastructure. You might see a realignment around who, how much do you like your device and how much do you want these companies to sort of step down in their sort of encroaching control and power over your private life? And I think politics will reorient themselves around that. And I think people will be increasingly, even more so than they are today, glued to their phones. And that's why that's going to happen.
Okay. Well, there you have it. Okay, this has been Community and Technology, Stu Reid, Dave Burstein. We've been speaking with Derek Robertson, writer, reporter, and producer at Politico. Derek, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Stu and Dave. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
Okay, good. Thank you. This has been Community and Technology every Wednesday, 5 to 6 p.m. Stay tuned. You just might learn something. Thanks for tuning in. Good night.